One. Okay, what's going on YouTube? It's PNG Media News here, back with another edition of the this is a little bit different of the Concrete and Steel Chronicles. A lot of you all have been asking me to do stuff on Chicago gang history. So I got a Chicago native, Tony on. You know, he grew up around the scene. He knows a lot about it. So he's gonna give you all a good overview of the Chicago gang scene. What's going on, Tony?
Hey, how you doing? It's nice to meet you. I appreciate you for having me.
Oh, I'm glad you came on, brother. So tell the people, what's your history with Chicago? Were you born and raised there? And so, what area were you from?
Born and raised in Chicago. I grew up in Englewood, 56 and Honorary. My address was actually on 65th and Artesian, but my family and my grandmother and everybody stayed right there on 56 and Honorary. And I went to grammar school. I went to St. Basil, which was just pretty much up the street, like maybe 2 blocks from where she grew up. So all of my friends were there, right there on 56 and Honorary, between Woods and Walcott. So that's pretty much where I was pretty much raised.
All right. And so what area did you grow up in? Like what years were you growing up over there? Like 80s, 90s? What era?
I was born in 78. So I grew up around there. Of course, when I became conscious of a lot of different things, it's pretty much the 80s and the 90s, and of course going forward. Of course, when I got into my teenage years, like I said, it's all through the 90s and the 80s. I was still a little young, but of course, when I got a little older, grammar school, and then up to the 90s, and that's when I became a real conscious of a lot of different things that was going on around me.
Okay, so in Englewood, that's a pretty notorious neighborhood in Chicago. When you were growing up, what was the dominant group over there?
The dominant group, actually, it was kind of funny because right there on Honorary we had Blackstones. From Honorary back to Walcott, there were Blackstones, but from Woods we had some GDs, and then on a other street we had MCs. So it was like all bunched up together. But as time went on, of course, the Blackstones end up dominating that part of Woods where the MCs were. I mean, I'm sorry, where the GDs were. Excuse me. And they end up kind of, I guess, removing them, and it became pretty much a dominant. Blackstone and a couple other blocks over was MC.
So you said a couple of different names there. So can you kind of like define those names, GDs, MCs, and Blackstones?
Yeah, Black P Stones, of course, they started off the Blackstone Rangers back in the early 50s and 60s. Went from the Blackstone Rangers to the Black P Stones. And of course, you had different branches of Blackstone. You had Reubenites, which was the area that was dominated where I grew up there. They were called Rubes, or short for Rubes. And you had, of course, you had Russian stones, you had Titanic stones, you had all different factions of stones. Egyptian stones, the Israelite stones. You had so many different stone groups, and GDs, of course, Gangster Disciple, and of course, MCs, Mickey Cobras. There used to be Cobra Stones, of course, and went from Cobra Stones, and of course, after the death of Mickey Cogwell, they named themselves after Mickey Cogwell and became Mickey Cobra. After they broke off on the Black Stones.
All right. So those different branches. Now, did that concise all the gangs in Chicago, or were there more different types of gangs in Chicago?
Oh, they were way more Black and Hispanic, and even some white ones. Of course, we know that everybody thinks that Chicago is just dominated by GDs and BDs now, of course. But like you said, there are Blackstones, of course, GDs, there are BDs. You got MCs, you got Black Souls, you got Four Corner Hustlers. You got so many different factions of vice lords. You have on the Hispanic side, of course, you got Latin Kings, and you got Satan Disciples. You got 2-6, you got Party People. It's so many different gangs that they ain't heard of. And then, of course, white ones. They're not around too strong, but the white gangs, you had the Gaylords, and you had the Simon City Royals. They were predominantly at one time white gangs, but I think actually the Simon City Royals dominate Mississippi now. They're the one of the biggest gangs in Mississippi, especially in the
Okay.
Mississippi penal system. But yeah, the St. Prison
Wow.
Road was once a Chicago gang, but now they're heavy in Mississippi, believe it or not.
Wow, I
So
didn't know
yeah,
that.
it's
Okay.
so, oh yeah. Chicago has so many different. I mean, so many smaller gangs, bigger gangs. Of course, the big gangs I just named, but you have so many different pockets of smaller gangs. You have, like I said, Black Souls. You even have Latin Souls, which
Mm,
the Black Souls and the Latin Souls came about because I forget the guy's name, but it was actually two guys, a black guy and a Hispanic guy, and they were close friends. And
mm,
the story that I got of research is that their mothers moved, and they said they will always be soul brothers and connected.
mm,
So they created, in order to kind of show that camaraderie, a black division became the Black Souls, and the
mm,
Hispanic side became the Latin Souls. And I know it
mm.
used to be every year they used to get together, like picnics and everything, to kind of celebrate their brotherhood. I'm not sure if they
Mm.
still do it today, but I know it was a time where they did have every year they got together, Black Souls and Latin Souls, and kind of like, just kind of kept up tradition between the
Okay.
two. But that's how
Wow.
those two branched off. So it was a lot of black gangs had a lot of influence on a lot of Hispanic gangs, believe it or not. That's why a lot of Hispanic gangs had the disciples. Um,
Mm,
and I mean, so many. We had people don't realize we also had the Puerto Rican stones. The Puerto Rican
mm,
stones were a Puerto Rican branch of the Black Stone. So they
mm,
branched off the Black Stones, and Jeff gave them their own little faction. They became the PR Stones, and then I think they became the Familiar Stones, and then they
mm.
became something else. But I know at one time it was a faction of the Black Stones that was actually Puerto Rican called the PR Stone.
Okay.
So
Okay. So all these different gangs, how do they relate to each other? Is there any type of alliances or coalitions, or they just all separate entities?
they were aligned through, for the most part, of course, it started in the prison system. I want to say the exact date. I want to say the exact year, I should say. It was between 76 and 78.
Okay.
They developed what they call the Peoples and the Folks Alliance. And of
Okay.
course, and it was mostly a prison alliance, but of course, the ones that roll with whoever became the people and folks. So, for instance, under the Folks Alliance, you do have the GDs, you have the BDs, you have the Satan Disciples, you have the 2-6. Of course, under the people, you have Blackstone, Vice Lord, Latin Kings. So all of these different gangs, for one way or the other, uh, joined up, and whoever was fighting whoever, for instance, the 2-6 and the Latin Kings were notorious for their wars with each other. So because they were warring with each other, okay, of course, one joined the Folks Nation and the other one joined the People Nation. And it was basically
Mm,
just a unification between organizations in jail to kind of keep the peace, keep everybody safe. So it was basically
okay.
pretty much an alliance that benefited pretty much everybody. Even if they
Mm,
didn't want to join, they had to link up with someone, especially the smaller gangs.
mm,
Um, they definitely had to link up, uh, like the Latin Counts, and you had so many different other smaller gangs that were bigger than or smaller than some of the dominant Black and Hispanic gangs that pretty much unified in the prison system to bring about a understanding, a peace, and some cases they they joined hands in fighting against what was going on in the prison system as far as protesting, whether it was from food, whether it's from bad conditioning. So there was some benefits to the alliance with the people and folks nations.
okay.
And I think it probably was more stronger in prison. Of course, I don't
Mm,
think it was as unified on the outside for the most part,
mm.
but especially on the inside, I think they had even more structured, like they even do now. I think it's still more structured on the inside than it is on the outside, especially today.
Right. Right. Okay. So now these gangs in Chicago, now how do they like function? Is it just a loose set of guys just banging, or they have like rank structure or rules they gotta follow, stuff they gotta know? Like for example, the Stones, from your observation of them, like, how do they function?
I think the Stones today, I think they still have a little structure. I believe depending on, I guess, what area you from, where you
Mm,
live. I think some have more structure than others, but I think they're more loosely associated today than they were back then. I think that's what all the organization.
Right. But back when you grew up in the 90s, like how did they move like back in the 90s when you were coming up?
They moved definitely with structure back in the 90s.
Mhm.
Coming up on Honorary, there were a few guys who we knew that ran the block, and everybody knew who they were, and they were kind of untouchable. Of course, it was pretty much structured there. I remember growing up, I used to see them have their meetings in a little circle, either right there on the block. Sometimes they might meet up at a park, and they just talked about what was going on in the neighborhood, talked about what was going on within the organization. Some of my close friends that I grew up with, uncles, were Stones. They used to kind of tell me certain things. They had a certain diet. I remember hearing my cousins, and actually my cousins were GDs, but because we kind of grew up together, it was really no beef. When my cousin came over there on Honorary, there's really not too much beef. And I can remember my cousin saying that some of these Stones, they talk about they don't eat meat, but they're around here sneaking eating pork. Little jokes he used to make. But I do remember a lot of the Black Stones who were actually part of the organization talked about how they couldn't eat certain things. And of course, growing up, I didn't understand what they were talking about. Like why you can't eat such. But then, of course, as I got older, I began to see how they kind of adopted a Islamic type tradition, Islamic type history. So it kind of came together in a sense, and that's one of the structures they had. So everybody, of course, knew who was who on the block. So I just remember this kind of sticks out.
The volume.
Call, but that was a little different for me growing up because I didn't know why. I always thought it was a Muslim thing, but of course I didn't know the correlation between the Black Stones and the kind of like that Moorish Islamic history until I got older. I talked to older people, and I even had some uncles who were actually Elrookians, who I kind of seen. They kind of had that traditional Elrookian look. They were tall. They had the long braids, and they just had a certain look to themselves and a certain structure about themselves. Not saying everything they did was right, but it's just like they still carry themselves in a different way versus what I see today.
Okay, so the Elrookians, now who exactly were they? Now, when did they come about?
I want to say, of course, if people, the history of the Stones is really deep, but just to kind of make it short, I want to say when Jeff went to prison in the late 60s, early 70s, and when he got out, I want to say in 75 or 76, he came out with a new organization, which of course was the Elrookian, because of his studying of Moorish history, his study of Islamic history. Jeff Ford came out with I will say, of course, I never met him personally, but just from my history and to the understanding and things that were passed down to me, he came out with a different idea, a different structure. About 76, he created the Elrookians, which was pretty much, some people, if you listen to some of the documentaries, they pretty much say they were more organized. They were more of a close-knit unit than the Black Stones, because the Black Stone was made up of so many different gangs that came under the Black Stone umbrella. And when he came out with the Elrookians, it was a different, I guess, vision he had, a different view of things. And in 76, I want to say he created the Elrookians, because when he was paroled to Milwaukee first. I don't think he was allowed back into Chicago, but he was paroled to Milwaukee. And of course, from the Stone side, if you talk to some of the Stones, they say Milwaukee is Medina and Chicago is Mecca. It's kind of like their whole play with the Nation of Islam. Detroit is Mecca, Chicago is Medina. Come similar like that. But when Jeff Ford came out and created the Elrookians, it seemed to be a more militant, more structured type organization, which caused a lot of friction with a lot of guys who didn't want to accept that this new look, this Islamic look that Jeff was bringing to the table, which caused a lot of internal wars between the Stones, who didn't want to drop Stone and who wanted to continue to be Stones, but they didn't want to practice this Islamic thing that Jeff Ford came out when he got out in '76.
Okay. So but during that time, was Jeff Ford still considered like the chief of the Stone Nation, or did he just totally move away from that and just be a rookie?
You have many different. I think you have many different versions, and of course, depending on who you're talking to, they say one thing and somebody say other. But just from my observation of seeing it, I think he just wanted everything to become Elrookian, and because some people said that he felt like the Stones were a little bit too unorganized, they were too unruly. And I want to say, and I mean, like I said, I don't have no solid proof, but I do want to say that Jeff kind of knew there might have been maybe some informants maybe on the inside, and he just kind of wanted to close ranks a little bit because the Stones was a huge organization. I mean, if people know Chicago history, they will say the dominant street organization on the south side of Chicago were the Black Stones at one time. My mother, who don't know absolutely nothing about gangs, told me that when they came here in the '70s, going into the '80s, that she remembered just seeing the word Black Stone written on walls. So that's the only gang she remember. And so it's like she don't know no other one but Black Stone. And that's just from her observation, what she's seeing written on the walls. But I think I just think he wanted to kind of close ranks for whatever reason, because Black Stones were real huge. And he just came out with a different vision and just wanted to change it for whatever. Some people say he just wanted to change it to hide other things, or some people say he was sincere. I never talked to the man, so I don't know. All I know is that he did switch the organization to Elrookian, which caused a lot of people to get upset. And like I said, it caused a lot of internal fighting, and it caused a lot of people to get shot. Unfortunately, that's just the history of that. I mean, a lot of people felt like they, fought and bled for Black Stone, and for you to come out and say that now we practice this Islamic teaching and wearing these garbs, some people weren't going for it. That's just what it was, and a lot of people had different beliefs. Even before Jeff Ford came out, a lot of people practiced Christian faith. I mean, that's just what it was. A lot of people see Black Stone today as some type of Islamic group, but a lot of people don't understand when it first started, it didn't have a really Islamic identity. It had more of a Black Power identity, especially coming from the '60s and going on up today, but not necessarily a Islamic identity or of a Black Power identity. And a lot of people say that Eugene Harrison or Bull was the one that kind of gave the Black Stone that Black Power identity, even in the '50s and the '60s, and them even working with the at one time kind of loosely, even with the Black Panthers, going all the way back to that time until they became an actually gang again in 1986. In 1986, Black Stones became its own independent. That's when all the laws came down, jail, prison. That's when he went to jail, 80-45 or something like that. So in '86, the Black Stones became Black Stone again, but just not a nation. It was just its own entity at that time, its own gang, and not so many loose affiliates that made up Black Stone in the beginning.
Okay, so I mean, are you saying that the different branches just kind of dropped their names? Everybody just took the name Black Stone, or tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, some branches drop their name. Like for instance, you still have. Now I don't know how organized they are, but even today, you still have like they call it Titanic Stone. And just from my research, the Titanic Stone was one of the branches that really gave Jeff Ford headache, so to speak, kind of resisted a little bit more than the other branches. Of course, some other branches faded out. Some other branches still exist, maybe to a smaller degree, but I know that the one for sure that still exists is Titanic Stone. They still exist. And I know they were one of the ones that kind of resisted Jeff after the transition to Elrookian. And so a lot of them did phase out. You had the Gangster Stones. I want to say the leader of the Gangster Stones just passed, like what, 2-3 years ago. Abney, if I'm not mistaken, his last name. I want to say they went in Hearing Horners, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the project that they kind of dominated. But yeah, I want to say he died about maybe a couple of years ago. But yeah, they were still around. And maybe a smaller in number, but the Gangster Stones were still around. And the Titanics, I know for sure, are still around. I think some of these younger guys who's rapping claim Titanic. But yeah, so
now,
a lot of them dropped off.
Okay. Now you mentioned Eugene Harrison, aka King Bull. Now, what was his role in the whole history of the Black Stones?
I know just his role from the very beginning. Before him and Jeff teamed up, he was head of a gang called the Harper Boys.
Okay.
Over there in Hyde Park. They were called the Harper Boys, and some people say that Jeff already had the Black Stone. First, they were the Blackstone Raiders. Somebody say the Raiders, Blackstone Raiders, and then they became the Blackstone Rangers. And then when Jeff and Chief Bull hooked up and kind of brought their organizations together, then that's when they became the Black Stone Nation, because now they had so many different, and then they just kind of swallowed up other groups. But pretty much Eugene was pretty much like, some people say the co-founder, some people say founder. Like I said, it all depends on who you talk to. Eugene, they said Eugene was more of the one that kind of led them to the Black power, the Black identity. Eugene was more conscious of Black history, they say, and Jeff Ford was more of the face and more of the mouthpiece. And Eugene was more of the behind the scenes guy, but he pretty much gave them their identity as far as bringing on a Black consciousness. They said he was real instrumental in bringing the early Black Stones together with the I want to say LSD, Lord Stone's Disciple organizations. When they developed an organization, the Vice Lords, the Disciples, and the Stones, they called them LSD. And the LSD was pretty much a group, an organization that came when all these different gangs that historically may have fought each other, but came together to protest for jobs on construction sites. This was back in the 60s. I want to say 66, 67, somewhere around there. And they protest construction sites because they would discriminate against Blacks in those jobs. And they said, well, if y'all gonna be doing work in this neighborhood, you need to get some of these brothers these jobs. So the Lords and Stones got together, and the Disciples got together, created a group called LSD. People that was instrumental in there was people like Bobby Gore. He was one of the heads of the early Vice Lords. I want to say Benny Lee was around at that time. I'm not sure, but I do know Bobby Gore for sure. I want to say the founder of the Vice Lords, Pepperlo, I want to say he was very instrumental as well in forming LSD, if I'm not mistaken. But I do know for sure Bobby Gore was around at that time, and he made sure that LSD came together for the positive. You know, I know a lot of people look at it as gangs as negative, but sometimes throughout his day had some positivity to him. But Eugene was get back to your question. Eugene was one of the ones, they say it was a co-founder, and he was one of the early ones to bring that Black power identity to the Black Stones early on, which is why they took up the color. They say the red. I'm trying to mimic the red, black, and green. This is one of the early colors of the Stones that people don't realize that. And some people say it was Eugene that was very instrumental. In that identity.
Now I want to talk about. Now you mentioned another group, the Vice Lords. Now, what role did they play in Chicago gang history? Were they a South Side, West Side based? Tell me a little about the Vice Lords.
The Vice Lords are mostly a West Side based gang.
Okay.
Like I said, they a lot of people give them a start in the Boys Reformatory School in St. Charles in 53, 52, or somewhere around there by a guy named Pepperlo. They said Pepperlo was rejected by some of the bigger gangs that preceded the Vice Lords, like the Egyptian Cobras, I want to say, and it was another big gang at the time. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was another big gang at the time. But anyway, he was rejected by these gangs, and he said he basically pretty much gonna start his own. So that's where he developed the Vice Lords, and of course it spread from there. But yes, it was mostly a West Side gang. It spread throughout the city, but it's dominant on the West Side. I know on the South Side we had some of the Vice Lord factions, not as big, but growing up I do remember across Damon. And if anybody live around Honorary, they know what I'm talking about. It's a set of Vice Lords. I never found out what set of Vice Lords these guys were, but I can tell you these guys were notorious. I don't know what set. Again, I don't know if they were conservative. I don't know if they were travelers. I don't know what they were, but I just knew they were vice lords, and I knew they weren't nothing to be messed with. And I know they had a couple of run-ins with the Stones on my block at the time. There was a few shootouts here and there, and a lot of people. If people live around there, 56 and Artery, around Damon, the Garrow spot, people know where the Garrow spot is. It was like there was kind of cannon corner to the Garrow spot. There was a gas station, and it was further back. There was some vice lords. Now, like I said, I don't know what faction, but them guys were, of course, we reckon with. But to go back to your question, the vice lords is a dominant West Side gang. That was started by Pepperlo in the 50s. It's pretty much spread throughout the West Side, and they did the same thing like the Stones did. They kind of brought in a lot of different gangs that was around that time under the Vice Lord banner. As a matter of fact, I've read somewhere where actually Jeff was related to one of the co-founders of the Vice Lords, and it's actually in a book called The Nation of Lords by David Dowley. And they said that Jeff was related to a guy named Calloway. Calloway was another either co-founder of the Vice Lords, and that kind of gave Jeff Fort also some of his organizational skills. A lot of people say that some of his early organizational skills he learned it from his cousins who were Vice Lords. And some of the Vice Lords even said that Jeff Fort used to spend a lot of time at his cousin's house, and he kind of picked up on a lot of different lingo and a lot of different things that the Vice Lords were doing, and he brought that back to his organization. And that's kind of how Jeff got a lot of his early organizing skills, was because he was around some of the Vice Lords and they were all related somehow.
Okay. All right. That's interesting you say that, because I know how you were talking earlier, saying that the Stones had a lot of Islamic, teachings in their organization. I know at some point later the Vice Lords started to embrace Islam to a certain extent. Do you know anything about how that happened?
Vice Lord did. They the same thing. They embraced a lot of Islamic. I'm not exactly sure when. Some people would say it was in prison as well, but I will kind of beg to differ. I think it was also on the streets too. Somehow, like I said, I don't know which one. I don't know if it's Bobby Gore. I don't know if it's some of the early founders that kind of gave them that influence, or who brought to what. And I don't even know if it was all factions of Vice Lords, because there's so many different factions of Vice Lords. I don't know. I do know all. At one time, they all were under one umbrella. It was just different factions, and maybe not so broken like they were, like they are now. But I do know that somewhere, all of them eventually adopted some form of Blackness, some form of a Black identity. Even going back into the 60s, again, it just goes to show you how powerful they were, how they challenged Chicago traditional rulers, so if you will, which is what they call the Daily Machine, Richard Daley. Richard Daley had it out for all of them, especially the Stones. I think the Stones and the Vice Lords were the ones that challenged his power the most. And I know if people remember, I want to say back in '67, when Richard Nixon was running against Hubert Humphrey. And of course, if you won Chicago back in those days, you pretty much won the presidency in the 60s and going into the 70s. And Jeff Ford, they did a no vote campaign, and they went out to challenge Daley because they were tired of some of the tactics that Daley was doing, that Jeff Ford and the organization kind of wanted to show their power. So, of course, Richard Nixon being a Republican candidate and Hubert Humphrey being a Democrat, and of course, the Daily Machine being a Democratic machine, the organizations convinced a lot of people not to vote. And what ended up happening is that Richard Nixon ended up winning. And I think that was the first time in Chicago's history in a long time that a Republican actually won a ticket in Chicago. And that was due to a lot of those street organizations that pissed Daley off in '67. And he, of course, a lot of bogus charges being thrown at him. And of course, that was a time where Jeff Ford got an invite to the White House from Richard Nixon or his staff. And I don't know if people remember, but that's when he sent Mickey Caldwell and another brother to the White House to represent the Stones. And a lot of people don't realize it wasn't because they were Republicans, so to speak. I do believe there was reasons behind why Jeff Ford did it. Of course, he wasn't really Republican. I just wanted to see if he wanted to kind of do a power play. That's just my personal observation. And he ended up sending Mickey Caldwell, and of course, they got him pissed off. And then here comes 1969. And then I want to say May, if I got my dates right, I want to say May 9th, 1969. I think the Daily Machine had it with these gangs, at these organizations. And by that time in 69, of course, you had the Black Panthers. You know, Fred Hampton was trying to work with a lot of the street organizations. And Chicago was just taking a turn for the better as far as Black people were concerned. I think they were turning the tide on a lot of traditional Chicago politics. And because a lot of people don't, well, kind of go back real quick, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of Irish and Italian gangs, when they were gangs, they used to run around like they accuse a lot of the Black gangs of doing now. But the difference was is that they were allowed to be politicized. So they began to dominate the mayor, aldermen, the police department. So they were able to organize, and they were eventually end up running the city. The Hamburger Club, which was the gang that Richard Daley Sr. was a part of, is still around to this day up in there Bridgeport. So kind of going back to 69, May 9th, 1969, the state's attorney, Edward Harahan, and Richard Daley declared a war on gangs in May 9th, 1969. And after that, that's when everything fell down. They started arresting some of the organization leaders. Bobby Gore, that's when he got arrested on bogus charges of murder. Of course, that's when they started attacking the Stones. And then, of course, December 4th, 1969, that's when they assassinated Fred Hampton. So, but what people don't realize is that including in the war on gangs, they also included the Black Panthers also as a gang. So they not only declared war on the street organization, they also declared war on the Black Panthers. And once they did that, that's when the whole Hammerhead and the CPD and FBI, all of them started doing so many different things, and they kind of broke a lot of the movement, the progress that Black people were making in Chicago after the assassination of Fred Hampton. And of course, they kind of broke a lot of the alliances with them and with some of the street organizations that were trying to be politicized. And it's almost like Chicago haven't been the same since December 4th, 1969. So yeah, I know I said a lot, but
so it's kind of safe to assume. So one was to say that Jeff Ford and his organizational skills were partially, if not largely, responsible for Richard Nixon getting election. Would that be accurate?
I believe in Chicago, yes. I really believe that, and I believe that's why he received that invitation. And I think it just kind of showed his power. This guy was very powerful. I mean, regardless of where he got his organizational skills from, it just goes to show you the fear and the power that he had in the city. A lot of people don't understand it. A lot of people can't understand it of why so many people followed him. I remember there was a guy that went to the church that I attended back in Chicago, and he, when I watched that movie, Judas and the Black Messiah, that scene in the church, a guy who used to be a bodyguard of Fred Hampton used to go attend my church, and he told us that when they went to that meeting with Jeff Ford, that all he did was kind of raise his hand, and so many stones came out of nowhere. He said that's how powerful the guy was. He said he just waved his hand, and people popped out from all over the place. So that scene in that movie was kind of accurate. I don't know why they call them the Crowns in that movie. I think I heard Fred Hampton Jr. say something like they didn't have clearance from some of the original Stones. I don't know what it was, but it did kind of draw a lot of confusion for people who don't know, because a lot of people think that a gang called the Crowns existed in Chicago, and I'm like, no, it didn't. And people think, and then you have some people on YouTube who make comments like, those were the Vice Lords, and I said, no, Vice Lords were not dominant on the South Side. That scene in that church took place on the South Side of Chicago, and I said that the Stones are not have allowed Vice Lords to get that much power on the South Side. And that got to see the West Side. They have a chance saying, okay, those were the Vice Lords, but the church took place, I want to say, close to Hyde Park or in Hyde Park. And in Hyde Park, we know that the dominant group in Hyde Park were the Stones. So yes, the Jeff Force Power was kind of different. I think as far as that level of organization is concerned.
Okay. Now we're going to talk about another dominant group, or dominant leader, Larry Hoover. He's still talked about today. What was his role in the whole disciple, and what role did he play in Chicago gang history?
It's almost like similar to Jeff in a way. Of course, he a lot of there's so many different things going back and forth with the history. And this is why sometimes I wish I could talk to these guys myself, because you get so many different, but the traditional thing goes that he was a leader of a group, or co-founder of a group called the Gangsters, Supreme Gangsters. And him and Barksdale was a part of a group called, they called them at the time, Devil's Disciples. And they two kind of got into it for a while, and then they end up eventually coming together. A lot of people don't realize that too in this. I want to say it was Jerome Freeman also that was early on in the development of what became known as the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. So it was a combination of Larry Hoover's Supreme Gangsters, David Barksdale's Devil's Disciple, which he changed to Black Disciple, and I want to say Jerome Freeman's group was the Egyptian King Cobras, if I'm not mistaken. And they all came together and became the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Or either Black Gangster Disciple or the Black Supreme Egyptian Cobras or the Egyptian King Cobras. One or two, I know they say Jerome Freeman was somewhere in there. And they developed that organization and became the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. I actually read a book by Wallace Gator Bradley, and it said it somewhere in the book that growth and development was actually developed in the early 80s before it kind of hit the streets. After he changed it out, of course, they say the whole split. I've heard Don Dirk speak, and he said they never really split, or they never really had a problem. But for whatever reason, when they supposedly broke up the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, I do know that they said that Larry Hoover developed the concept of growth and development early on before it actually hit the streets, and became a growth development because he wanted to shake that gangster persona off, because he wanted to change for the better. And of course, at that time, creating 21st Century Vote, when he was getting a lot of his guys out there to vote, which of course they never, ever want Black gangs to do the same thing that a lot of other ethnic groups did, and that's gain political power. And I think I do believe they would have controlled the city council and ended up controlling the city of Chicago if they were allowed to do the same thing that maybe the Irish did, the Jewish did, the Italians did. Everybody was able to do that, but Black organizations. And if you look at throughout history, whether it's Chicago, Detroit, whatever, you can see how a lot of the other ethnic groups were allowed to kind of grow and end up controlling some of the city and controlling a lot of different political aspects of that particular city. And I believe that's one thing that they do fear of Larry, is that he will maybe change these guys for the better, and the political power would have been probably nothing never seen in Chicago's history. Between those two guys, Jeff and Larry, it would have been. It always leads to my imagination of what would have been if those groups were allowed to grow. And then the Black Panthers, led by Fred Hampton, who was only 21 years old when he was assassinated. You just never know. The city, I know would have been totally different today. City of Chicago.
Right. So now when you say a Black Gangster Disciple, so that organization eventually, you mentioned three leaders. You mentioned Barksdale, Hoover, and Jerome Freeman. So whatever happened to those guys? Did they end up starting their own factions, or what took place? Because I know Barksdale eventually died, correct?
Yes, yeah, he ended up succumbing to a gunshot wound, like in the 70s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after he died, did Larry Hoover take the reins of power, or did the organization fracture after that?
It's a lot of different speculation that goes back and forth. So after he died, when Larry was locked up, there's a lot of speculation that said that, again, I'm just kind of just going off stuff that I've heard and read, but a lot of people said that Jerome Freeman was actually second in command, actually, of Don Dirk. And if you listen to some of Don Dirk's interview, which Don Dirk, of course, is still alive and he's out today. Um, I think with Black Gangster Disciple, I think Don Dirk, if I'm not mistaken, Don Dirk said that they saw some things that was going on, and things were kind of splitting off. So he said that he broke off pretty much and created what they called the Black Disciple, which was still in the line with what David Barksdale wanted. So when Don Dirk, I think he said he went to California or something and came back to got put back in prison. However it goes, one of the two, he got put back in prison, and he wanted to bring it back to where Black Gangster Disciple or Black Disciple was meant to be, that was laid by the foundations by David Barksdale. So he brought out that faction, but I think another guy that came with him was Jerome Freeman. Now, according to history, it was Don Dirk that gave Jerome Freeman the leadership of the Black Disciples, or it was something disagreement between those two. So it's a lot of stuff that kind of goes back and forth. And I want to say Jerome Freeman died, maybe he died some years ago after he got out of jail. But of course, he became known as the king of the Black Disciples when he got out. So it's a lot of different back and forth of why they split. And I want to say I heard somewhere where Don Dirk gave Jerome his power. I don't want to misquote Don Dirk. I can't remember if he said that he gave Jerome Freeman his power. It's somewhere where I read it. I'm not sure. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But I do know that it was some type of disagreement somewhere in there, and it kind of split off. But I do know for sure that Don Dirk said it was never supposed to be the way it is today, as far as how fractured it is and all the BD and GD stuff going on, and with all this music. I think that's more, and I tend to believe him, but it's more of a young man that's doing all this BD and GD stuff now than what it was back in the day. But yeah, it's different versions of Jerome Freeman and his leadership and his role in the BDs and Don Dirk, which if I'm not mistaken, they say Don Dirk is the one that gave Jerome Freeman his power. So yeah.
All right. So we got about 20 minutes left. So I just want to go over a couple of names and we can kind of wrap things up. Now, what about another name I often hear was Booney Black? Are you familiar with who that was?
Yes, I know. I know Booney. Well, I don't know him, but just from the Black Gangsters. The Black Gangsters are also supposed to be a spinoff of the Black Gangster Disciple. And it was something that happened in prison. Now, the story goes, again, people can go back and read themselves, but somehow somebody tried to put a hit on Booney Black in prison. Somewhere I read, somebody tried to put a hit on Booney Black in prison. I think Booney Black wanted to retaliate, and there was something to the fact that Larry didn't sanction it or something like that, and then he got upset and he broke off and became his own entity and controlling the Black Gangsters, which is also was spent off from them later on, was a game called the New Breeds. I've read somewhere where it says that in prison, they Black Gangsters, on the streets, they New Breed. And the reason why New Breed spent off on the Black Gangster, there was no war, is because a lot of people say that the people that created the New Breeds were related to Booney Black. So that's why there was never no war between the New Breeds in the beginning and the Black Gangsters, because they were related. So the story goes is that, again, on the inside, they were Black Gangsters. On the outside, they were breeds. So Booney Black, and I think he just died some years ago. But it's an interesting story. Real quick, I know we're short on time, but real quick, the interesting story goes that how Booney Black used to be a part of this group called the Royal Family. And the Royal Family were way back in the day, who were a spinoff of the Vice Lords, started by another guy named Roger Collins. Now, these guys were considered to be hitmen. And a lot of people said they did work for the Chicago outfit, which is, for a lot of people who don't know, is the Chicago's version of the Chicago Mafia. They call them the Chicago outfit. And yeah, he was a part of this group called the Royal Family early on.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's some deep history out there, and like I said, a lot of stuff that is confirmed through newspaper articles. A lot of stuff I wish I could talk to people myself, but those are just some of the stories out there that I've come across, and that I found that one interesting as far as Bonnie Black being an early member of this group called the Royal Family, who eventually did some jobs for the Chicago outfit, and not just in Chicago, but also in California too. They supposedly went to California and did the job on somebody who owed the outfit some money. And they got connected to one of the Chicago outfits hitman, notorious hitman. His name was Harry or Larry Elman. I think they call him Larry or Harry the Hook Elman. But his nephew knew somebody and got kind of hooked them up with the royal family and everything. So yeah, Booney Black, yeah, he's considered the leader of the Black Gangster.
Okay. So let me ask you this. So now if you look at Chicago today, like when we came up, there was leaders, chiefs, kings, all that type of stuff, clearly defined territories, and this was the Stone neighborhood, it was a Vice Lord, it was the GD neighborhood. But now, fast forward to the 2010s and 20s, there's no real leaders anymore. It's like neighborhood versus neighborhood, it's not even gang versus gang. When did you see in your opinion, when did the breakdown happen? When did all the structures start to disintegrate to the point where it's now just kind of like just at the wild, wild west now?
I think it really started hitting in the late 90s, going into the 2000s, when they started indicting a lot of the leaders. And a lot of their kids, nephews, and all this other stuff began to start taking over with no guidance, with no history. A lot of these kids now don't know no history, have no guidance, have no literature. And I'm not saying when they had literature, they were perfect either, but I'm just saying like there was still some form of, I know it sounds crazy, but some form of integrity back then. But today's time, I think a lot of those indictments that came about, that's kind of what broke down the structure. And it's almost like that saying goes, you cut the head off, the tail dies. And that's what we see. It's no longer a vertical leadership anymore. It's more horizontal. So I know some cases where you have 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds that's running whole blocks. I mean, 18-year-olds that's over 40 dudes that's willing to do anything he tell them to do. And a lot of these guys, of course, have no structure. A lot of these guys also create their own little crews. Nowadays, you have crews. They might be a crew of Mickey Cobras, GDs, and Blackstones that's fighting other GDs or other Blackstones. So it's like, and they name themselves after they block, or name themselves after one of their friends that passed, and they're giving themselves all these titles, and it's like there's no structure anymore. And I think that's what happens when they locked up all the heads, and nobody really wants to pop up anymore because they're scared of indictment. And because due to fear of indictment, it's kind of like you leaving your kids to kind of take over something that was looked at upon one time with some form of order, some form of structure, and it's no longer there. And we can kind of see the chaos now, and these guys have no they have no leadership. For whatever reason, I know some guys too, that older guys that may have taken advantage of certain things, and I don't even think some of these guys would honor a leader. Unfortunately, some of these guys don't even honor their own parents. So it's almost like if they don't honor their own parents, they not for sure not for to honor somebody that they never met. Let alone you got to pay these dues, these fees, this, that. They're not for to do that these days because unfortunately their homes are in chaos. So of course their mentality on the street is going to be chaos, and the stuff that they do from then on is going to be chaos. I always say to myself, that was one of the reasons why I believe personally that Bloods and Crips were never able to penetrate Chicago. And I believe that they were never able to penetrate Chicago like that because Chicago had so much structure.
Right.
There were too many people you had to report to. You had regions, you had governors, then you had the board. So there was no way that they want to let some crew from another state develop something that has nothing to do with Chicago at all. And I believe that's one of the main reasons why Chicago has never never adopted to or never mimicked California. Um, now I believe that if Chicago has started off then like they are now, then maybe they have a better chance, but not now, not then. They wouldn't have no chance. I just a quick story, and I'm not glorifying it, but I had a guy, he used to be a Stone, and he told me some back in like the late 80s, early 90s, some Crips tried to move in. I want to say he told me on 72nd and May, if I'm not mistaken. It was somewhere around May. It was 72nd or 74. They tried to move in an operation, and unfortunately, they met an untimely death. They dumped their bodies in the alley. So that's the story that he gave me. And he used to be a Stone, so it's like I know he wouldn't lie, but of course a lot of stuff don't make the news either. So that's just, a lot of people think that Bloods and Crips are everywhere, but I always tell them, even out here, that no, they never penetrated Chicago like that. Chicago was too strong. And Chicago gang culture is just as strong as California's is. So at one time, if not stronger, maybe it's a little loose now, but it would have never penetrated. But but back to your point, I just believe that's one of the main reasons why it's so much chaos today.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, that's a good note to end on. Well, I really thank you for taking your time to come, because I could go on for hours with this history stuff,
Of course.
But I don't want to, drag it too long. But I really appreciate you coming on. We have to do this again sometime. So just quickly tell if people want to know more about this, any particular books off the top of your head you recommend or anything like that?
I'll recommend A Nation of Lords by David Dawley.
Okay.
I'll recommend Ron. I always get his last name messed up. Ron
Chepsick?
Yeah, Chepsick. Black Gangsters of Chicago. That's a real good one for real good sources. It's another one they just came out with recently. That book skips my mind right now. But those two books right there will kind of guide you to different sources that they also got their information from. But Nation of Lords is a real good one. It talks about the history of the Vice Lords. They talk about a lot of stuff they did throughout the community. And also Black Gangsters of Chicago are two good books to start off with. And then also, it's a book that was written by Moore and a sister named
Natalie Moore and Lance.
Yes, Lance and Natalie Moore. It's about the Black Stones, Black Peace Stones.
Okay.
Yeah, that's also a good book. That book is pretty good. Give you a good resource, give you a good history, give you a good foundation if you want to know more about the Black Stones. That's a good book to start with. So I recommend those three books. All right, great.
All right. Well, on that note, we can close. So, YouTube. So there you have it. Just a brief overview of Chicago gang history. As you can see, it's deep, and we just kind of touched the surface of things, but the history goes way deeper. So if you want to know more, check out those books and stay tuned. I hope we have more interviews about Chicago gang history. So until next time, YouTube, this has been another edition of PNG Media News Media, Concrete and Steel Chronicles. Thanks for tuning in.